Okay, we'll look here first at Eric versus Sam. Now, e4, e5. I think there's a obvious problem with the idea of e5. You really got in the habit of like thinking, well, can they just take my pawn? That's not so good. If this game were to continue, try to attack the undefended pawn, but I mean he can just defend it, and then here probably the best thing black can hope for is maybe play d6, and then after pawn takes, at least you get your bishop activated, and so that game just kind of ended there. Sometimes something kind of similar is played. The idea of e5 isn't too bad, uh, but first they play knight f6, and so then c4 is likely, and now e5. And this is a little better, and the reason why is after d takes knight g4, not only is that knight attacking the undefended pawn, but you've also got a threat there against f2. A bishop can come out and you can get something like that going on. And so that's a little better way to play that. Regardless, though, Sam resigned and you guys started a new game. d4, d5's a lot better. And which game am I looking at here? d4, d5, c4. Yeah. So Eric is white, Sam is black. Um, yeah, you can take the pawn here. That's fine. Uh, Sometimes, maybe it's better to defend the pawn with e6 or c6, but you can certainly take that. And now Eric, right here, the best thing to play is probably e3. And the reason why is not only does it defend the pawn, but it also gives you the possibility of getting your queen attacking up towards a8. Whereas e4 sort of blocks that diagonal, and it doesn't defend the pawn on d4. And now Sam played b5, and this is a real common idea, b5, and you can really see here how it'd be nice to be able to play that queen to f3. For instance, if you look at e3 followed by b5, a4 maybe, c6 to defend it, capture, capture, and then there's that queen to f3 attacking a8. And so that's why e3 is maybe a little better than e4 right here. But e4, and b5 is probably not the best idea right here. Might seem a little odd, but now actually e5 is going to be your best move for black. And yeah, he can just take it, but the nice thing is you can now do that because you've cleared out the pawns on the d file. So queen takes, king takes, and now that knight's sort of hitting that pawn. And if he defends it, you can play the bishop attacking the knight. And the big problem for white is that king is sort of decentralized. So, e5 is definitely a move that you should be thinking about, but you want to make sure you gain something rather than just losing the pawn altogether. right here, e5 is probably pretty good. And the only real reason is because you get that d file. b5 is certainly also playable, though. Now, here, I guess there's really two options you can go with. Knight to f3 is just, standard development. Sort of defends the pawn and controls the center. A little more aggressive maybe is a4. Once black starts pushing these pawns, it's good to counterattack against them. And that's especially true when this e4 pawn is actually down here on e3, because then you can get that diagonal like I said before. So probably knight f3 or a4 right here. d5, d5 really doesn't do anything. You need to, before you move a pawn, you need to really have a reason to move it. Otherwise, you're just wasting time. You're wasting moves. That pawn's not attacking anything. It's not really going anywhere. It's perfectly fine right where it was on d4. And in fact, now black's best idea is probably to counterattack, because this pawn is kind of overextended. It's kind of too far forward. Maybe c6 or e6 to put some pressure on it. Sam played c5, and these pawns are now getting kind of weak because they're really far forward and they're not very well defended. And once again, for white, probably the best idea here is to counterattack with a4, because that pawn will be, well defended on a4, and it can attack this undefended pawn on b5. If you just look at that really quickly, a4, how is he gonna really defend it? If he plays a6, you can take, and then you win the rook. And if he pushes it forward, you win the c4 pawn. So that's kind of the idea. What if he plays bishop d7, take, and if he recaptures, you're not really up a pawn, but not only is the bishop under attack, and he's got to move it, so you sort of gained a free move with your knight, but these pawns are now really weak and isolated and not very well defended. So try to remember that idea of a4. In contrast, e5, once again, just like d5, you're not really doing anything. Pawns actually tend to get weaker as they move forward because they get further away from support. And so white right now has these pawns kind of weak, and black has these pawns kind of weak. So what could black do here? Probably the best idea is to attack either e5 or d5. And there's two kind of obvious ways to do that. Bishop b7 or knight d7. And just start, putting pressure on those weak pawns. What Sam played now is b4. And of course the real problem here is white now can just take the pawn on c4. So, try to really understand, Sam, that when you're moving pawns forward, they're actually kind of becoming weaker. And so this guy here is doing something there, but you play him forward, and he's not really doing anything at all. And you actually lose a pawn right there. So b4, b takes. And once again, these pawns are kind of weak. Probably good to try and counterattack them. e6 makes some sense. e6, take, and now you have this diagonal, or this line. So there's a definite kind of weakness there that white has, and you can use that to counterattack his pawns in the center. Instead, Sam played f5. And yeah, it's true, pawns become weaker as you push them forward, but once they sort of really start to reach the other side, then they become stronger, so it sort of shifts. Once you get here to e6, this pawn's now really strong, because it's defended very well, and it's right up inside black's position. That's why, e6 was really probably the best idea here. Right here the pawns are weak, but now they're strong. e6 was definitely a very good move. And probably the best thing for black to do now, you really can't do anything about the pawns in the center. Maybe queen a5, threatening some kind of check there along that diagonal. But Sam, you played f4. And, once again, you're sort of drifting forward with a pawn. It's a wasted move. This pawn on f4 is not doing anything. It's not going anywhere. And in fact, white can just take it, which is what Eric did. Maybe a little better Eric actually would have been to play bishop b5 check. Because you don't really need to take that f4 pawn to win this. Black's king is really got nowhere to go here. And so this is going to win material. Really the only thing he can do is either knight d7, bishop d7, queen d7, which all loses material. With bishop takes probably best, but... And then after all that, now you take the pawn. So try to exploit, the major weakness in his position. Because you can take this pawn later. That's one of the weaknesses of pawns. That pawn's not going anywhere, so you can kind of ignore it for the short term. But taking it is all right. And of course, Sam has this big problem now, right there. And probably the best thing you could do about that is to play bishop takes the pawn. And at least that's a pawn for a bishop and kind of disrupts his position a little bit. But I mean, black's losing this right now, so there's not a lot that black can do. But bishop takes is definitely better than g5. There's a lot of things wrong with g5. One thing, you can just take the pawn on g5, which, it seems to be a theme. Quite a few of these moves, Sam, is you're just pushing pawns forward and letting white capture them. And if you do that, you're just going to lose game after game after game. You need to not do that. And there's an even bigger problem with g5 is Eric missed checkmate here. Queen h5. That's checkmate. And so you can really see how that pawn on e6 is really dominating black's position. Instead of playing checkmate, Eric played bishop e5, which is, still a pretty good move, hitting that rook on h8. And Sam tried to block that with knight f6. But once again, there's that theme of queen h5 check. You can take the knight when he recaptures. There's queen h5 check, king e7, queen f7 check, king d6, and black's position's looking pretty bad there. Maybe next knight d2, threatening to come up here with another check. That's probably the best way to go about this for white. But bishop b5 check was played, and that's not terribly bad either because of that e6 pawn. And once again, probably the best thing black can come up with here is bishop d7, which obviously loses material. But that's certainly better than knight c6. See, Sam, how that, here at least with bishop d7, you're gonna, get a pawn out of it. If we look at that, bishop d7, e takes, and now knight takes d7. At least you got a pawn for your bishop. But here, you just lose a knight. Bishop takes. And look, you actually played bishop d7 anyways, so there was no reason to lose your knight just to play bishop d7. You should have just played bishop d7 to begin with. And Eric now, he takes the rook on a8, but slightly better would have been bishop takes d7. Because if he tries to take with this knight here, you have queen h5 checkmate. So bishop takes would have definitely been better. But bishop takes a8 is alright too. Queen recaptures. Recapture the bishop. King takes. And now here, Eric played d6. That's another one of those sort of pawn moves where the pawn's not really going anywhere. It's not, if the pawn's not threatening a piece here, it's probably not doing all that good. It's moving forward, and it's actually under attack. Surely there's got to be something you can do here that's better than just moving a pawn. And, one idea would maybe be queen a4 check. But white played d6. And another problem with d6 is here the pawn is blocking this diagonal. But once the pawn moves forward, now black can play queen e4 check, which helps black out a little bit, although black's still going to be losing there. It's a little more aggressive. So, yeah, d6 wasn't the greatest move. Sam just took the pawn, though, instead of queen e4 check. And that, of course, loses the knight. Rook moves over. Queen g4 check. King e8. It leads to a really quick checkmate there. Queen e6 check. Bishop e7. Queen takes e7. So that's Eric versus Sam. And then you guys played another game. And you guys should really try to move slower and just play one game instead of 2 or 3 games. Use your time to really think and not just drop pieces. So this next game is Sam versus Eric, and Sam is white. Opens up very similar, d4, d5. Sam here, I know I've told you this before. Try to listen to my advice, because it is good advice. C4 is really probably the best thing to play here. You know, if he takes the pawn, you play e3, and that bishop can recapture. Plus, you're going to have this idea of queen f3 maybe, or queen b3. So I like c4 here, but you know, there's nothing terribly wrong with knight c3. People do play that. I just don't think it's as good. And black now, you know, a lot of options that black can play. Probably knight f6 is best, maybe bishop f5. c5 is also playable. Same idea. The c pawn's going to be defended by that bishop on f8. Eric, though, played e5. This looks really familiar from the previous game. You guys really need to learn from this. You can just take that pawn and... Oh, what happened here? And Sam, you know, I don't know why you didn't take the pawn. Like, you saw that, like, literally 10 minutes previously, that the pawn is undefended on e5, so, you know, really just take it. That'd be good. Take the pawn. If you can take something, you know, it's probably okay. Instead, Sam played e4, and how do you proceed with this now? You know, obvious idea is maybe for black to take one of those white pawns, but which one's better, the e pawn or the d pawn? And it looks like the e pawn is better, and the reason why is because you take it and then he recaptures, and now you can grab that pawn on d4, and so you're kind of up a pawn right there. Or if you take the e pawn and he takes your e pawn, now you can play queen takes d1 check, and that drags his king over so he can't castle. So taking the e pawn is a little better, maybe even a lot better. Other way is what was played. E takes d4. Yeah, it looks great because you're attacking his knight, but I mean, there's a real easy way for white to have dealt with this. Sam, there's a pawn right there. It's undefended. Just take it, and your position would be really good. You'd be winning this right now because you'd have a strong centralized queen, and you'd actually be threatening this pawn on d5 next. So e takes d4 is not so good because queen can just recapture. You know, for some reason though, instead of taking the pawn, you just run away from it. You know, don't be afraid of it, just kill it. And that allows black now to take a second pawn. And so black's up 2 pawns now. Once again, Sam, you can take this pawn. So that would be the best move, queen takes d4. Instead, though, f3 was played. And, you know, now probably black should just defend the pawn on d4 with either c5 or probably a little better is knight c6. You know, if he plays here knight c6 and then he takes your e pawn, you have queen h4 check. It's usually not a good idea to play that f pawn forward because there's always this problem with the queen can then come to h4 check. So yeah, f3 was played. Knight c6 would have been a good way to defend the d4 pawn. Once again, we see this idea of pushing into his position with e3. It's, yeah, it's kind of a good idea, but the difference here from the last game is this pawn is very weak, and so this shouldn't really work very well. Hopefully you can guess what white should do here. It's just real simple. Just take it. Queen takes d4. Problem solved. You don't need to play c3, which was played. And at this point, c3 is actually really weak. Pawns do kind of become weaker as they move forward. You can see here the c pawn is controlling d3, but once you come forward, it's no longer controlling d3, and so black can just come forward. d3 would have been really strong here. On d4 the pawn is weak, but on d3 it's well defended, and now these two pawns are, threatening to, come down here and really mess with white's position. So yeah, d3 would have been really good here for black. Instead, though, Erica defended with c5. Then there was an exchange, c takes, c takes. Right here, instead of, immediately recapturing, you probably could have had a slightly better position with knight e7, which is a little counterintuitive. But the idea is now if he takes on c5, then you can take on d1, which is good. And if his bishop takes on e3, now you can play knight f5, which is a little more problematic for him. You might defend the bishop and play queen e7, put a lot of pressure on that bishop, and then maybe he'll move the bishop to safety, but you still kind of have this d pawn here. I don't really expect you to see knight e7, but you should certainly look at it and try to convince yourself that, yeah, that is a little stronger after knight f5. And another way to look at this is, instead of focusing on, well, what's so good about knight e7, is just look at what's wrong with c takes d4. And, hopefully by now you've gotten the idea, is it's just weak. Queen takes d4 would have been best. Sam played knight takes d4, and it's not as good because now the knight's kind of pinned to the queen. This is much better, where the queen is in the center, and if he takes your queen, then your knight can come out, and then your knight's in the center. But here it's a little weak, because if the knight moves, he's always got queen takes d1 check. Next here, for black's move, probably the best thing is, always be aware of these checks. Bishop b4 check. And that's, sometimes doesn't work as well when there's a pawn on c2, but there's not. If there was, that pawn could come to c3 and block. But that's not really going to be an option now. After bishop b4 check, if he tries bishop d2, of course, you've got this pawn on e3. So yeah, bishop b4 check would have been really good. Bishop c5, it's okay. Trying to attack this knight on d4. And now Sam makes another one of those pawn moves that doesn't really do anything. b4. I mean, Sam, you got to realize he can just take that check. And also you got to realize it doesn't do anything about this problem on d4. So you just, lose material there again. And then this is even worse. Queen takes d4. I mean, that's just obviously, hopefully wrong. And now there's not really anything white can do here. Rook b1 to try to defend the pawn was played. Queen c3 check. And, probably here white needs to play king a2, but bishop d2 just lost immediately. So, yeah. Sam, what you need to learn from this is quit just kind of making the first move you see and pushing a pawn forward. Try to anticipate, well, he's going to capture my stuff. So try to make sure stuff is defended.